Hi, I'm Andrew Brokus. You may know me from such podcasts as the Thinking Poker podcast and such blogs as the Thinking Poker blog. I'm trying something a little different today. This is going to be kind of a video blog post addressing a question or a comment that was left on the blog about a hand that has been discussed actually on the last two episodes of the podcast. But I think it's a pretty interesting hand, and given that we've already delved into it in some depth, I think it might reward even further depth. So I'm just going to show you the hand quickly. I think some of you might appreciate being able to see it in visual form. This is from a $1,000 W-Coop event. It was a six-handed tournament, but as you can see, we're five-handed right now. Quite a tough table. I think all these players were pretty competent, and we can see we're pretty relatively deep in the tournament. I think we're certainly in the money at this point. So we've got an under the gun raise from this off position player, and I've Jack 9 suited in the big blind. Don't think there's anything too controversial about defending there or about check calling the flop. I turn the ace of clubs, prepared to check call again, and it ends up going check check. We get to the river, and I think this is where it gets sort of interesting. We discussed this hand quite a bit on the podcast, so if you're curious to hear the reasoning for why I made the play that I did here, you can listen to episode 143 of the Thinking Poker podcast is the first time that we discussed the hand. So you can probably, the easiest way to find that is just to Google Thinking Poker podcast episode 143. You could also go to thinkingpoker.net, click on the podcasts tab and find episode 143, and then discuss the hand again on episode 144. So what I end up doing here is check raising the river, so turning my hand into a bluff on the river by check raising. And I did win the pot. I ended up getting an interesting comment on one of the blog posts from, here we go. The comment, or two comments really, came from Rant2112. And if I'm not mistaken, Rant's real name is Matt, so I'm probably going to call him Matt or Rant over the course of this video. So what he did was he actually put this hand into Poker Snowy to see what kind of output Poker Snowy gave, and he ended up getting some pretty surprising results from Poker Snowy. For one thing, Poker Snowy has villain always betting the turn, and it has hero always checking the turn, and then it also, well, I think Matt also kind of speculates here as to some possible shortcomings of Poker Snowy, which was my initial impetus for starting to look into this. I think he's right that this is not the sort of spot that Poker Snowy is going to do a great job of analyzing, in part because since Poker Snowy always bets the turn, I think that it doesn't really get to this spot on the river very much, and I think consequently its advice here is not going to be real well tuned. But it seems to show hero being indifferent between calling, raising, and folding with Jack 9 suited, and raising only very infrequently. That doesn't sound wildly unreasonable to me, but I was kind of surprised by some of these outcomes. I initially was thinking about writing a blog post talking about why I think the correct play might deviate from what Snowy is suggesting, talking both about some slightly exploitive things and also what I think might be some shortcomings of Snowy. But what I ended up doing instead was putting the hand into GTO Range Builder, which I think was certainly going to do a better job of Poker Snowy, better job than Poker Snowy of delivering an actual game theoretically optimal strategy for turn and river play once we input flop ranges.
Now you can see this is the equilibrium strategy that GTORB outputs when I give both players two options, or I guess three options when the action is on them. So the hero first act on the turn has the option of either checking, betting 45% of the pot, which is the fraction that the villain actually bet on the river, that's where that number came from, or betting all in. Those are the three options available to the hero. In a second, so one thing I'll point out to you is that there is actually a small donking range for the hero. The hero donk bets 2.2%, and I'll show you what his donk betting range, whoops, that's not what I meant to do, what his donk betting range looks like. So it's got some really nut hands in there, Queen 10, 3-3, Jack Jack, some pretty nutted hands like Ace King and Ace Jack, some hands that are betting for some common. I mean, these are essentially blocking bets, like the king eight, king nine kinds of hands are in there as blocking bets. There are hands like queen jack that are in there, or some combination of like blocking bet and and also a bluff that has some significant blockers. So blocking queen 10. That's kind of what this range looks like. I'm actually, for the sake of simplicity here, I'm going to take this option away from the hero. I think we're going to find that it doesn't affect his expected value very much, considering what a small part of his range this is. And as you can see, trying to balance a range like this and trying to do something like this range, that's not what I wanted. This range that we just looked at. Trying to keep track of which of these hands belong in your donking range and at what frequency. And okay, with king 5 of clubs, you should be donking. Actually, I said these are king X flush draws that are betting here. Okay, that makes a little. So you should be betting like king 6 of clubs 1% of the time. Trying to do stuff like that as a human being is pretty difficult. And I think it's not going to affect our bottom line very much if we just take away hero's donking option entirely. So this is something that is that I know is kind of a deviation from optimal strategy that I am okay with employing in real life situations, because with very little influence on my expected value, it greatly simplifies the decision making process and avoids a situation where I end up like over under bluffing by trying to have this kind of weird tiny donking range. So I'm going to talk about some other situations, notably involving the river check raise, where I think that deviating in a big way from, or taking a strategic option off the table that is actually a strategic option that's employed at equilibrium, that does actually have a pretty big influence on things. But I think this is not going to be, we'll test it in a second here, but I think this is not going to make a big difference to the hero's expected value. So you can see that at equilibrium, and this is not, this doesn't take into consideration the actual turn card. This is just looking at across all possible turn cards. So the villain here has a pretty strong advantage. Both he has a stronger range than the hero does, and also he's in position. So his expected value is more than twice that of the hero. We'll see how this changes when we take away the option to donk bet for the hero. We can do this by going to customize game tree. And as you can see, the game tree actually includes two different options for the hero. The hero has the option of either betting the small fraction of the pot or going all in. At equilibrium, he didn't use the all-in option at all. He's probably not going to use it even once we take away his option to make a smaller bet, but just in case, I'm going to delete both of these. So I'm going to force the hero to check on the turn. He's just going to check 100% of his range to villain, which is what I would have done in that actual situation. And then we're going to go back here and solve this, and I'll pause the video until it's ready. As predicted, there's no impact or no noticeable impact to down 2 decimal places worth of precision to the hero's expected value. Actually, the villain's remains at 7, so I think we're really not seeing a change really at all to the hero's expected value as a result of not having that donk betting. So just checking 100% here, really not costing us anything appreciable. At equilibrium, meaning in a scenario where the hero is going to have all his options on the table on the river, so the hero can check raise the river, the hero can overbet the river. The villain ends up checking about 60% on the turn and betting about 40%. So we're looking at a 60-40 ratio of bets to checks. And we'll look at what his betting and checking ranges look like. So interestingly, he's actually indifferent to betting pocket aces, and this may be because he has to fear a big check raise, and it may be because he's kind of slow playing it in order to get value on the river. It's actually pretty common before the river for people to be indifferent with quite a few different hands, so we are seeing that here. In pocket threes, bets pretty frequently, but not always. Jacks betting more frequently than aces. Queens are actually betting here, I would presume as a bluff, but a pretty significant bluff because they're blocking the nuts. The nuts is betting at a pretty high frequency. Queen 9 is another, Queen 9 and 10-9 both actually are two air hands that are blocking the nuts, and those are doing a lot of betting. Ace Queen is a safe value bet because it's, even though it's only top pair, it does block the nuts. So that I think is maybe why we're seeing that value bet more often than Ace Jack or Ace 10, even though Ace Jack is a stronger hand, Ace Queen and Ace 10 are pretty similar hands, although Ace Queen and Ace 10 are in my range, so they're certainly not exactly the same hand. Interesting that Ace 9 happens to be one of the only hands here that is that is not indifferent, that is always checking. I'm not entirely sure how to explain that, but we see that both weaker and stronger aces are betting sometimes, but ace nine is not betting. So that's kind of what villain's betting range looks like in this scenario, where he has to consider the possibility of getting check raised on the turn, and also, here is in a position to potentially play a large pot with him on the river. So, I'm checking 100%, villain checking 100% behind. I'm not going to do a lot more exploration of the turn strategy. Although one thing that I'll point out is that the only options I took off the table were for the hero to donk bet. So the hero is allowed to check raise all in on the flop. The villain is allowed to jam over a hero check raise. And in fact, what we find is that even though these players at future decision points have the option to go all in, the only time they use it is when they won a bet of 45% of the pot will put them all in anyway. In other words, they always use their smaller bet option when they're given that opportunity. Here we see the hero, when he check raises the turn at all, he only raises the 13.4. He doesn't exercise his option to check raise all in, even though he's allowed to. And the villain actually has a range for 3-bet folding to a check raise. So the villain has a range for 3-betting to 32.3 and then folding if the hero jams 56.5. You can see after 3-betting to 32.3, the villain calls 57% the villain calls 80% and folds 20%. I suppose we could actually look at what those ranges look like. So the hands that are 3-bet bluffing from the villain are pocket queens and ace queen. I think both of those are pretty significant in that they're blocking. So ace queen is blocking some of hero's strongest, like 2-pair combinations, and also blocking queen 10. Pocket queens is blocking queen 10. I think both of these hands have pretty minimal showdown value against hero's checking range, so that they don't really check raising range, such that they don't really mind turning into bluffs. They're not really strong enough hands, I guess, to call down. And then of course we've got queen 10 is going to be getting all in. Pocket jacks and pocket threes are going to sometimes 3-bet and get all in against that check raise. So that's kind of interesting, but not really relevant to our particular hand. Now we want to move forward and look at how things play out, what the equilibrium strategy is going to be on this particular river, which was the 7 of spades. So in the scenario where it goes check check on the turn, first important thing I want to look at is that the hero does exercise his option to shove. This is about 5.5 times the pot. The hero does do this with some frequency on the river facing a turn check, and this is not too surprising. This is a pretty, you certainly see this in toy games when you're looking at a polarized range versus bluff catcher type range. And most of the hands that the villain is checking behind on the turn are bluff catchers. He has a couple of slow plays in there, but for the most part, he's not checking that many combinations of the nuts on the turn. So what the hero can do on the river is he can turn every non-nut hand the villain has, every hand that isn't queen 10, the hero can just turn that into a pure bluff catcher for the villain by shoving with queen 10 and then also shoving with some bluffs. And he does want to do that at least some amount of the time. And then he also has a range for making a more normal value bet, and we're going to look at what both of these ranges look like. So unsurprisingly, the shoving range consists, the value portion of the shoving range consists mostly of queen 10. There's a little bit of jack jack and a little bit of 3-3 in there, but mostly it's queen 10 that's jamming for value, and then that's balanced. Actually, the better place to look at this is here. And then that's balanced by some hands that block queen 10. So queen jack is in there shoving, ace queen actually is in there doing a little bit of shoving. Some pocket threes blockers are shoving along with the pocket threes. I'm a little surprised to see like the king 4, king 5 shoving. So most of these hands I can kind of understand why they're in there. I'm a little surprised that like ace jack is capable of shoving for value. And I'm more surprised to see like king 3 in here. That's one of the more surprising things for me. Ace 10 is never in there. I mentioned ace jack already. Even the fact that king 3 can shove here is pretty interesting. So I'm not entirely sure what to make about that. I wouldn't have expected to see those hands in Hero's shoving range. Hero's small betting range is where most of those. No, that's the details. Here we go. Hero's small betting range is where I would kind of expected to see more of those, they're hands that you're value betting, but not necessarily that you want to put in 5.5 times the pot. So we've got King 7 for kind of a weak 2 pair, Ace 3 for kind of a weak 2 pair. Most of the King 3 is in this range. Hands like Ace Queen and Ace Jack. So this is kind of the value portion. Of course, the ratio of value bets to bluffs is higher here because the villain is getting much better odds to call, so we're not going to be bluffing as often when we do bet. This is where a lot of the Jack X is going. So Jack 7 is a value bet, but Jack 6, Jack 8, a little bit of Jack 9 and Jack 10 are going here in this bet out on the river range. And this actually is different than what I predicted in when we discussed the hand on the podcast. My prediction or my description of how I was going to play the situation was that I would actually be betting out on the river when I had a hand like Queen 9 that had no showdown value at all. That's the kind of hand that I would want to use to make a bluff on the river. And then check raise bluffing the river, I would be taking hands that had some chance of winning at showdown. Like I was thinking Jack 9, the actual hand that I check raised on the river, that I would be checking that hand, having some chance of winning if it goes check check, and then check raising if my opponent did actually bet. So it's interesting to see that that's not what happens at equilibrium. That actually the hands with no showdown value are checking, and it's hands that have, I don't know how much showdown value Jack 6 really has, but it's a pair that is being employed as part of the bluffing range. And not a particular, there's some 3x in there as well, but some Jack X is being used as part of Hero's betting range. So we can look at what Hero's checking range looks like. The hand that I actually checked, Jack 9 suited, does go in there at a quite high frequency, including Jack 9 of clubs. That's generally a hand that's checking, so I guess I'm so far so good in terms of the exact hand that I had. There's a lot of stronger King X that's checking. Some of that Ace X stuff is checking. Queen 9 is just checking. And then once the villain bets, when he bets, so he does actually have a very small jamming range. He'll jam about 2% of the time, and then the rest of the time he'll bet 4.6. When he bets, at equilibrium, the hero has a range for both for making a small check raise and for making a big check raise all in. Nonetheless, he's folding 76% of the time to this bet from the villain. And that might be kind of surprising because with the hero folding at this frequency, the villain actually profits by betting the villain can auto profit here by betting air. If he has a hand that has no chance of winning a showdown and the hero is folding 75% of the time to a 45% pot bet, then the villain can essentially auto profit by betting there. And this might be the sort of thing that you wouldn't expect to see at equilibrium. You might think, well, shouldn't the hero be playing in a way that prevents the villain from auto profiting? And I think what we're seeing here is that the villain doesn't actually get to this spot with hands that need to do that. So essentially, the only hands that we're going to find the villain bluffing with here, I would have thought, would be hands that had no chance of winning a showdown. And we actually do see some Queen 9 and 10-9 in his range. I guess the issue is just that he doesn't have enough of those to fill out his bluffing range. So even though he can always profitably bluff with Queen 9 and 10-9, these are the only non-showdown value hands in his range. Other than that, hands that he's betting are hands like King 10 that, if that's turning into a bluff, or pocket queens, maybe even a better example of hands that, if you're turning those into bluffs, it might be more profitable than checking with them, or we see King 10 actually is indifferent between checking and betting. But they are hands that have some chance of winning at showdown. So if he checks behind on the river with pocket queens, he does have some chance of winning at showdown, even though he does better by betting it. In fact, he basically never checks behind pocket queens. It's not a hand that's without that has no chance of winning. So when we talk about making villain indifferent to bluffing, it doesn't mean necessarily calling where if he bets half the pot, we have to call 2/3 of the time. It means that that would assume that he has no chance of winning a showdown. If he has a chance of winning a showdown like he does with pocket queens, then we don't have to call that frequently in order to make him indifferent, because he needs to win more than 1/3 of the time with his bluffs when he bluffs with pocket queens, because the expected value of checking is not 0. So we're comparing the expected value of checking to the expected value of betting. And the EV of checking air is 0. The EV of checking queens is not 0. And so I think just because villain doesn't have that much air in his range, even though he does have a little bit, the hero is not defending at enough to make the villain indifferent. And so villain has a clearly profitable bet with his complete air, and in fact even with queens. I guess he wasn't different with queens, but he was almost always betting the queens. So we're actually playing in a way that makes villain indifferent to bluffing with queens, rather than in a way that makes villain indifferent to bluffing with his complete air here. And I think that's just a function of how little complete air the villain actually has in the spot. Now facing this bet of 4.6, we can look at what the hero strategy is going to be. And Jack-9 suited is in fact always folding. So this is not a hand at equilibrium that ends up getting used as a check-raise bluff, even though I chose to use it as a check-raise bluff. So let's look at what Hero's check-raise bluffing range looks like. So first off, he doesn't do it very much. He's only check-raising about 5% of the time, and some of those are shoves and some of those are smaller check-raises. The smaller check-raising range contains some nuts, contains some ace-king, ace-10, I suppose. Yeah, I guess functionally ace-10 is in here turning into a bluff, blocking hands like ace-king and queen-10. So there is some showdown value that's turning into a bluff with the river check raise. It's actually more showdown value than I would have thought. I took a hand like Jack-9 and turned that into a bluff, but actually it's something that's as strong as ace-10 that's in there. And then the check jamming range, I think that's where we're going to see most of the queen-10 that checked. Yeah. And then also again some hands that have a lot of blocking value like ace queen. Once again, king 3 is in the jamming range, which is surprising to me. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to look at how does it affect these players' expected values if we take the hero's opportunity to make these over bets or to check raise the river. We take those off the table because a lot of people, I think this is realistically how a lot of people play. And the question that first kind of inspired this investigation, Matt was saying that Poker Snowy always bet on the turn and then didn't really know what to do on the river, and I think that's actually quite different. Like it's kind of weird. I mean, I think this is not a great spot for Poker Snowy in general, but I think that it's kind of weird that Poker Snowy is saying to bet the turn so aggressively, and yet real life opponents, I feel like are actually I see a lot of checking behind in spots like this. I feel like I kind of expected the villain was going to check behind very frequently when I checked him on the ace, just because I think a lot of people aren't going to bet hands like ace queen and ace 10 there, and I just think a lot of people tend to play that as like a check behind and then value bet or bluff the river sort of spot. And so I want to talk about why that is. I think it has to do with the fact that so few heroes overbet or check raise the river. That kind of rewards villains who play passively on the turn. They're essentially exploiting the fact that the hero won't overbet or check raise the river by checking behind the turn a lot and then doing more of their betting on the river. And I think we're going to see that as we start to take some of these options off the table for the hero, which is functionally what people do when they say, oh, I never overbet, I would never check raise this river. When you take these options off the table, you kind of I think a lot of villains have adapted to that, and we're going to see how you're playing right into their strategy, so to speak.
What I want to see now is if we take away a couple of heroes' options to reflect. So I think one thing that we tend not to see, even though I think we saw the hero was on the river. So after the villain checks behind the turn, a lot of villains' checking range falls into that bluff catcher type range. And as we saw, the hero actually had a pretty healthy range for just jamming 5.5 times the pot on the river with a polarized range and putting a bunch of those bluff catchers in an uncomfortable spot. And I know that that's not something, and I think I do more overbetting than a lot of people do, but I still don't really do it as much as what we see at equilibrium. And I know a lot of people simply are just never bet 5.5 times the pot. And their reasoning is kind of weird for this, where they say, well, I'm not going to do it with the nuts because no one ever calls, but then I'm not going to do it with a bluff because I never do it with the nuts, or it's going to look bluffy, or it's kind of circular reasoning. And so I want to look at what's the impact if the hero both never check raise, both never just open jams the river and also never check jams. So if the hero kind of restricts himself to betting 45% of the pot on the river, or making a small check raise on the river, and those are the only two options the hero has for putting money into the pot on the river, after the turn goes check check, how much does that affect the hero's profitability? So we saw before the game was worth exactly 7 to the villain, and now we're going to see in a world where heroes not allowed to overbet on the river, how much is that hurting us? So we've taken away his option to overbet the river, and we're also taking away his option to check shove the river. So now the villain knows when he checks behind the turn, he's not going to end up having to play a big pot. Did I do this right? No, I didn't. I just deleted the wrong thing. I deleted here. We want to add back in the option for the villain to overbet. He's allowed to. I want to take out the option for the hero to overbet facing that check raise. So now we're going to take that off, and now, so the villain knows now. He knows that if he checks behind the turn, he's not going to have to worry about facing a big river bet. He's not going to have to worry about playing for stacks on the river. And we can think about how that might affect his range. Probably it's going to make him feel more comfortable checking behind medium strength hands, or he's going to have a lot more incentive to do that, because if he bets a medium strength hand on the turn, he could get check raised and then face a big river bet. If he waits until the river to bet his medium strength hand, he never has to worry about facing a huge bet. He's never going to get shoved on. The worst case scenario is just that he faces a small check raise on the river. So the villain has a lot more incentive to check back medium strength hands, which I think is how a lot of real life villains play, as kind of an exploitive adaptation to the fact that heroes aren't overbetting or aren't overbet shoving this river, and aren't check shoving or check raising the river all that much in general. And we're also going to see that the villain probably has less incentive to slow play the nuts, because if he checks behind the nuts on the turn, he's not going to end up playing a big pot on the river. But we'll so let's see if that's what actually happens. What we're seeing here is that the value of this game has increased by a little over 1% from the villain. So it went from being worth 7 big blinds. These are measured in big blinds, by the way. It went from being worth 7 big blinds to being worth 7.09 big blinds for him, as a result of the hero never making more than a small check raise on the river. We see that he's actually checking behind less frequently on the turn than he was before, which is not exactly what I was predicting. But let's look at the composition of that range. So what we do see is that he's betting more often. So hands like threes are no longer indifferent between betting versus checking. For some reason, 3 of diamonds, 3 of hearts is, but some of the other ones are always betting. Pocket jacks, yeah, so the sets are betting at a higher frequency. Queen 10 is not indifferent. Queen 10 is always betting. And we do see, so we'd already seen ace-9 checking behind before. A hand like ace-jack that really doesn't want to face a shove is now checking behind more often. So let's see, what are the hands? I guess the hands that are betting more frequent, the hands that have gone up in betting frequency, are those nutted hands. Another kind of medium strength hand that's now strongly prefers checking behind is king-queen offsuit. And the weaker aces are actually betting at a higher frequency. I'm not entirely sure how to explain that. That's one change here. I'm not real certain what the explanation is. But so this is what the villain's range looks like in a situation where he knows that he's not going to have to face a shove on the river. And now we can go to the river, with the river being the 7 of spades. And see the hero, because he's not allowed to check shove or maybe that's not the reason, but the hero is betting about a third of the time here and checking 2/3 of the time. I imagine, well, I guess we can look at where Jack-9 suited lands in this range. So Jack-9 suited Jack 9 of clubs is mostly betting. The other two Jack 9s are mostly checking. That's kind of interesting. And then after we check, the villain is not going to have to worry too much about value betting, because he's not going to face a big check shove, so he can do a lot of thin value betting. And we see like ace queen, for instance, basically always betting, doesn't have to worry about running into the nuts, and even if it does, not going to get check raised that much. Queen 9 and 10-9 always bluffing. I'm surprised ace 10 isn't value betting here. I would think that would be a strong enough hand to value bet. It seems like he's just kind of taking showdown with a lot of that ace X. Let's look at what the hero's check raising range looks like after villain bets. So Jack 9 is not in there, but some weaker jacks are. So Jack 9 actually is folding, and then there are some weaker rat jacks that are check raising. So like Jack 8 and Jack 6 are check raising. I guess the reason for that actually is that Jack 9 is blocking a lot of villain's bluffs. Jack 9 is blocking Queen 9 and 10-9, whereas Jack 8 and Jack 6 are not. So that's actually a pretty, we do here see the hero turning some Jack X into a bluff. We just don't see him because some of villain's bet folding range is Queen 9 and 10-9. So Jack 9 specifically ends up being not such a great check raise bluffing hand. That's not really something that I had considered when I made the play. King X generally calling, but occasionally check raise bluffing. Ace 10 occasionally check raise bluffing. Ace King check raising for value. Queen 10 and pocket 3 is certainly always check raising. And now I'm going to look at the EV of specifically this river. So before we were just looking at the turn, but I'm going to look at how much it affects the hero in particular on the river. If the villain, so what we're looking at right now is an equilibrium strategy where the villain has adapted to the fact that the hero is not going to check raise, and I think this again is what we see from a lot of real life villains. We see players who they check behind a lot on the turn, and they value bet pretty aggressively on the river because they really aren't worried about getting check raised period, or certainly not about getting check raised bluffed. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to take away the hero's option to check raise at all on the river, which again, I think a lot of people don't. Like either they bet the river or they check call. They don't really check raise. I'm going to take that option away again. I'm going to see what villain's range looks like, and then I'm going to lock those ranges in. So I'm going to have the villain playing this strategy that's designed to exploit a hero who never check raises, and I'm going to give hero back his option to check raise. And what we're going to see here now is that even though at equilibrium it's not making a big difference to the expected values that whether or not hero has a check raising range on the river. If the villain has chosen to adapt his play to exploit heroes who never check raise the river, and you do in fact check raise the river, then I think we're going to see that you do pretty well in that situation. What we're looking at now are the equilibrium strategies in a scenario where the hero, as we can see, doesn't ever really try to play a big pot on the river, which I think is actually how a fair number of people play. After it goes check on the turn, they tend to either bet the river or check call the river. I think there's a lot of people who just aren't going to have a river check raising range in this situation at all. And when they do bet the river, they don't bet particularly large. This is a significant deviation from the optimal strategy in this situation. We saw that, in fact, the hero should be exercising his overbetting option somewhat frequently. And so to never do that, and also to never check raise the river, it's a pretty significant deviation from the optimal strategy. The main thing I want to pay attention to here, two things. I mean, one is that the villain, knowing that the hero is going to be playing like this, has very little incentive to bet any kind of extremely strong hand on the turn. So the villain's range for getting to the river is pretty capped, and that's safe because the hero never puts any pressure on the villain. And the result of that is that we don't see the villain trying to play a big pot here either. So neither player is making overbets or a series of raises or anything like that, and that's in the villain's interest because the hero has hands that would like to play a big pot. The hero has nut hands in his range. The villain does not. And so the villain is going to be betting all of his nut hands on the turn because he knows that if he gets to the river by going check, check, he's never going to play a big pot. And I think, again, this is how a lot of villains have kind of adapted to play, because so few people will overbet the river into a turn check, or will try to check raise the river after checking the turn. A lot of villains can very safely check back a very capped turn range and then just make a thin value bet when they face another check on the river, or respond appropriately when they face a small bet from the hero, but they never really face a lot of pressure with their non-nut hands, and consequently they can just take a pretty capped range to the river. What I want to look at is how does this how much can the hero improve his expected value by playing that more aggressive strategy that involves overbetting and check raising, including check shoving. If he does that against a villain who doesn't expect to see it, and who modifies his turn and river ranges accordingly, thinking that he's not going to see overbets and check raises, and then actually faces them, how much can the hero improve his expected value from the situation where he's not allowed to do those things? So we can see here the hero's expected value is 3.25, and now I'm going to lock the villain strategy and assume that he plays the same way, but give hero the option to overbet and check raise against him, and we'll see how much the hero's expected value improves. And it turns out that the hero is able to improve his expected value when he goes from being exploited, essentially, having an opponent who checks back the perfect range against him on the turn and then is able to play pretty well without facing any pressure on the river. The hero had only 3.25 in expected value, and he now has 3.86. So he's able to improve his expected value by about 20%, which is not huge in terms in sort of absolute terms. We're talking about 2/3 of a big blind in this spot, but given that the pot is not that large to begin with, there's only 10 big blinds in the pot to begin with, so we are talking about improving our outcome by about 7%, or 6.7% by 6.1%. Whatever. Improving our expected value by a noticeable amount as a result of taking this more aggressive strategy against the villain. To be honest, the results are not quite as dramatic as I thought they might be. One thing that surprises me is that even when the villain is checking back that capped range on the turn, and we give hero the option to overbet the river, he doesn't use it. He actually does better by waiting and check raising all in on the river. So his river betting range actually has an extremely small river betting range. It probably is not going to change his equity much at all if he just always checks again to the villain on the river, which again is probably how I would play. Or maybe the only hands that I would really consider betting on the river might be hands that block a lot of villains' bluffing range. So if I had something like ace jack, I might consider betting on the river, just because I'm blocking a decent amount of what villain might otherwise, worse hands that he might value bet if check to, and then possibly call a check raise. So I think that maybe it's not so shocking to me when I think about it that hero doesn't exercise the option to overbet the river. The somewhat more surprising thing is that hero only ever check raises all in. He doesn't use the option to check raise less than all in. And when he does check raise all in, he does it 16% of the time. And despite that, the villain still bets 2/3 of his range. So what we're seeing here is that, this really is how you put maximum pressure on a capped range, or the sort of optimal way of playing against a capped range. Now, this is not taking into account the fact that we're in a tournament and maybe we want slightly less variance than what's going to be involved in the big check raise all in, but I think even if the hero only uses a smaller check raise, an option to check raise to something like 13,000 here, which is the size, or approximately the size that I used in the actual hand, I think that we're going to do a good deal better than if we're not allowed to check raise the river at all, and we're forced to either bet or check call, and which I think is in fact how many people actually play. So last thing that I want to look at is where Jack 9 suited fits into this, whether hero should be check shoving Jack 9 suited, and it looks like no. In a world where our check raise size is all in, Jack 9 suited is simply a hand that's going to get check folded. The check shoving range is certainly going to include all combinations of the nuts. Ace king actually is strong enough to check raise all in, and I think that's a bit significant. I think a lot of people aren't going to think of like top two pair as being strong enough to check shove, given that it's not the nuts or even that close to the nuts, but it does block some very significant. So, when you have ace king, it's pretty hard for you to be beat. Villain has so much incentive to bet his queen 10 on, or if you can exploitively assume that villain will bet his queen 10 on the turn, which is what we're doing here, that he thinks he's not going to end up playing a big pot on the river if he checks the turn, and therefore he never checks the nuts on the turn, then ace king goes way up in value. The other two very likely hands that beat ace king are aces and kings, and those are both hands that ace king obviously blocks pretty hard. So ace king actually can be jammed for value here. King 8 and jack 8 getting jammed as bluffs. So kind of interesting that jack 9 is not bluffed and jack 8 is. I think I speculated previously on why that might be, or what the salient difference between those hands might be. Jackson 3 is also shoving for value, even though they don't block aces and kings. I guess just again, aces and kings are hands strong enough that the villain is betting them on the turn frequently enough that he's going to have to pay off the river check raise with weaker hands than this. So blocking a king seems to be pretty significant for hands that are bluffing. And I guess like pocket kings and ace king are a pretty big part of villain's bluff catch range. Ace jack is doing some check raising for value, although ace jack is indifferent between raising and calling, which is not true for queen 10 or ace king. Those hands are all kind of part of the nut pole. These are just hands that are, we're jamming here with all hands that are better than wherever villain is capped at, and then also with some bluffs. And despite that, or no, I guess it's not despite that, actually, because we locked the villain strategy. So what's happening here is that the villain is betting a bunch of hands that he would prefer not to bet if he knew that the hero were capable of jamming on him. He's betting a bunch of hands that are actually going to be pretty miserable when they get jammed on. So let's look at his defense range facing a jam. It's the kind of thing where he's like, why did I bet with that? So he's indifferent to calling with ace king. He's indifferent to calling with, I guess he always calls with jacks. So his sets are really the only hands that can snap call here. Kings is out of his range entirely. Queen 10 is out of his range. Or I guess he's got maybe some very small fraction of that. But queen 10 basically, or has very few combos of queen 10, doesn't have any kings. So even a hand as strong as top 2 pair, villain ends up being indifferent to it when he faces that check shove. And I think these are hands that might not bet, or at least not bet with this frequency, if the villain knew hero were capable of check shoving. So once again, this is how he gets exploited here. If he assumes that he's never going to get shoved on, and in fact he gets shoved on 16% of the time, these are the kinds of hands that are made miserable. Even a hand as strong as top 2 pair ends up being put in a pretty nasty spot, and the hero is actually able to value bet pretty wide, even for an all-in raise. I think that's kind of an interesting illustration of how different the optimal strategy is, both if both players play perfectly, and also the optimal strategy if the villain is doing something that he's doing something exploitive in order to take advantage of common exploitable play made by a lot of heroes in this spot. If you actually are making the right plays against him rather than the exploitable plays, you can see that there's a pretty dramatic difference between the two and a noticeable increase in expected value as a result of that.